It's Tuesday, August the 8th, 2023, and let us gather together and experience the goodness of God. I'm Pastor Trey Comstock. We begin with our scripture of the week, Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21, and a piece entitled by me, Enough Already. Then I'll be with Pastor Emily to talk about scripture and my encounter with a newsmaker. But first, a reading from the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. Now when Jesus had heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came and said to him, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He said to them, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds, and all ate and were filled. They took what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. An internet friend of mine introduced me to a new app called Too Good To Go. I love the premise. Restaurants and grocery stores often have items that don't sell at normal prices in normal time range. If you run a donut shop, you don't always sell all the donuts that you made in any given day. However, no one wants to pay full price for day-old donuts the next day. What do? Or as a grocer, folks didn't buy as many bananas this week, and now you've got a bunch that have gotten too ripe to sell, but are perfectly edible. What do? Normally, you toss a lot of this stuff into the dumpster. Too Good To Go creates an alternative. You, as proprietor of a restaurant or grocery store, can list your leftover items for sale at extremely discounted prices. Folks logging in know that they're purchasing leftovers, select a specific shop to buy from, purchase the items that would have gone to waste, and show up to pick them up. You made some money on perfectly edible food that you would have junked. The customer saves some money, less food gets wasted, everybody wins. The people behind Too Good To Go want to help, but the existence of their service highlights the inequities and waste in the global food market. Feeding America estimates that the U.S. throws away nearly 40% of all its food, or about 130 billion meals. We could feed every one of the 7 billion people on this planet 18 meals each just on the food waste of one wealthy nation. We chuck day-old donuts, yesterday's leftover soup and salad special, fish that smells slightly too fishy, produce that looks weird but would taste fine, food that we bought, forgot about, and left to rot in a strange undiscovered corner of our fridge, and the cake that we ordered too much of for the party. Americans are not unique in this regard. A lot of edible food never sees the mouths of hungry people. In the news today was a report of a drone attack by the Russians on the Ukrainian grain port at Odessa that has damaged or destroyed, according to the Ukrainians, 40,000 tons of grain destined for Africa and China. I don't pretend to understand the international politics of all of it, but it's still more edible food that will never get eaten. Meanwhile, food insecurity touches every corner of the globe. The Houston Food Bank reports that 1 in 8 Texans suffer from some kind of food insecurity. The area where Servants of Christ is planted is largely a food desert with little access to good food. Urban areas in the U.S., a nation with vast resources, have it far better than other places in the developing world. Hundreds of millions of people still live on $1 per day or less. When I worked in Kenya, I participated in malnutrition testing for USAID. We went to schools around our area on dirt bike taxis and tested the students for malnutrition. At one of the schools, 70% of the students were suffering from some degree of malnutrition. When I worked in Paraguay, we lived and worked in a food insecure community and ended up suffering from it as well. I've been blessed and spent a lifetime as a fat and well-fed middle-class American. That summer of living on 1,200-ish calories per day did strange things to my mind. It also gave me a visceral introduction to how so many millions of people, even in my own state, even in my own community, have to live all the time. In feeding the 5,000 plus, Jesus compassionately fills the bellies of the hungry and the downtrodden. The story gets related in all four Gospels, but Matthew ties it in with Herod Antipas's murder of John the Baptist. They flow one story straight into the other. Jesus hears of John's death, the crowds keep following him, they end up starving and without resources. Jesus feeds them. In his Feasting on the Word exegesis of this passage, J. Wu Lee points out the contrasts. Herod Antipas, powerful ruler and Roman sympathizer, holds a meal for the powerful, and someone dies. Christ holds a meal for the sick and suffering who sought him out, and they receive love, compassion, and sustenance. Lee frames this as an image of two different kingdoms, one of this world and one of God. In God's kingdom, the hungry get fed. So, as we already know, we ain't there yet. The continued existence of hunger, especially in a world of plenty, should serve as a yardstick of how far from God's kingdom that we find ourselves. I know that the existence of a lot of food in one place and not enough food in another stems from a mountain of factors, from geography to geopolitics to macroeconomics to global logistics networks to cultural differences to peculiarities of the health code. Still, on a theological level, I find it galling. We live at a moment in history where, at long last, enough food exists to feed the planet. And yet, so many know hunger. So, what do we do as individuals in the face of global inequality? Committing to only eating day-old donuts and slightly too ripe bananas feels more than mildly insufficient. Certainly, there are any number of local or international charities working on food insecurity. In Servants of Christ's own corner of Southeast Houston, Finca Tres Robles is an urban farm trying to get healthy and affordable produce into this food desert of ours. Theologically, following Christ means living for others, not just ourselves. Thus, we should approach our own lives and way of living to facilitate the goals of God's kingdom. If we desire to live in a world where all have enough, we should take only what we need. Paul used this approach as a missionary in the first century, as he says in Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 14. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now, at last, you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned for me, but had no opportunity to show it. Not that I am referring to being in need, for I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well-fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. In any case, it was kind of you to share my distress. We love Philippians 4:13, but ignore its context. Christ strengthens Paul to live simply and be content. I confess that I am not there yet and need to hear this as much as anyone. I have not risen to Paul's level of contentment in God in all circumstances. I still suffer from the bug of conspicuous consumption. Also, making this leap in our faith merely constitutes a first step. Seeking your own simplicity will not, in and of itself, feed the hungry. It does mean that we start leaving more for others. contributing to others' potential abundance rather than robbing from it. The less that we consume and waste opens up opportunities for others to have more, for more people in God's kingdom to be fed. So as you just heard in the piece that I wrote, we are looking at the feeding of the 5,000 and looking at this relationship between, God's provision and what it means to have enough. And, both in the sermon and in the essay, what I call the essay, the piece, it looks at, this is a miracle about Jesus miraculously multiplying things. And I don't want to take away that read, right? That's in there, right? That's the literal surface. And, this miracle is recorded essentially the same way in all four Gospels. And so, one can take it as that's just essentially how the story goes. But I don't want us to get hung up on just sometimes Jesus miraculously provides. That's true. But to get into that bigger conversation of how does God provide? And one of the ways that God provides, and this is we've launched into a series called The Divine Provisions Go. And so we're going to be looking at over and over again at this idea of God providing. And part of God providing in this context is it's not always like just miraculous manna from heaven. Sometimes it is the moving of people to be a part of providing for others, providing for the world, doing the thing, right? That it's not just, there was nothing and now there's something. Those kinds of things happen, but that's not actually what happens in the feeding of the 5,000. We don't start with no bread and now there's bread. You start with someone offering up what meager they have, and then it goes explosive from there.
And that's part of this beautiful idea that God's math is not our math, that God's abundance is not limited by our worldly constraints, but it's also part of this upside down kingdom of God that we talk about, right? It's not, I like that you talked about the party of Herod Antipas and the rich and powerful, where not everybody was served. And then there's
it's not just not everyone was served, but a dude got killed.
Somebody actually gets beheaded, right? And then there's, this feeding of the 5,000 plus, because
right.
Again, we're not counting women and children in this number of 5,000. And this happens multiple times in Scripture, too. This is not the only feeding of the 5,000. But this is, one of the places where we see God's generosity through the actions and the willingness of the people who are there, right? Through this young lad.
Right. Yeah. So it's John's telling. There's this wonderful tool that most preachers have that is all of the gospel stories, all the gospel
the parallels, the gospel parallels.
And so I pulled up because it was like I know about the young lad. The young lad isn't here. Where is that young lad? And the young lad's
in John.
He's over in John.
John writes him down.
So, but in it was actually really cool to see that this is one of those stories where it's all, you have a column for Matthew, a column for Mark, a column for Luke, and a column for John. This is one of those stories where you've got all four columns represented, and in all four columns, in each version, there's the loaves and the fish show up, right?
Yes.
It is not, oh my God, there's no food. It's, oh my God, there's not enough food. And so do we have to, this is is this going to dissolve into Woodstock 69? What happened, one of the downside, and also Woodstock 99, both of those Woodstocks, you have a real, all of these people have shown up. There's not enough. And, at Woodstock 69, you see that, some of the feeding the 5,000 happens where, there's a lot of sharing. At Woodstock 99, eventually they literally burn it down. There are two great documentaries on this. Emily, you and I both know someone who was there. Actually, a former podcast co-host of mine on Scripture Talk, a previous version of the show, was there at Woodstock '99, and so I would tease him about it. But their response to there not being enough is essentially they get really mad and they burn it to the ground.
Right.
And so, the disciples come to Jesus with I guess they don't. I guess Jesus knows about Woodstock '99 because he sees across all time and space, right? But the disciples don't know that this could very rapidly become Woodstock '99.
Right.
And they're like, "Hey, do we want to let this party go before this becomes Woodstock '99?" And Jesus puts it to them, "No, you feed them. You do it."
I love how snarky Jesus is right there, right? He's like, no, you got this. You got it.
You got this.
Right? You feed them.
And you can
what
you can imagine I a lot of my playwriting has been dramatizing scenes in scripture, right? This is what the Catnip for Boomers, The Chosen. I've watched a little bit. It is very well done, but it is a lot. Most of the people who ask me, "Have you seen The Chosen?" are boomers.
Are of a certain
generation, or
Yes.
This leaks into some Gen Xers, but there's not a lot of Zoomers on the bottom going, "Have you seen The Chosen?" No.
Right.
Anyways,
you're not going to make a children's curriculum using The Chosen.
Yeah, it is another one of those trying to dramatize it, right? Try to fill in those blanks, and and I've had to do a lot of that kind of writing too. And you can imagine this interplay, right? The disciples' instinct does not come from a bad place. It's like, hey, we don't want these people to starve. We're out in the literal desert. We don't want these people to starve. And so they come to Jesus like, hey, so I guess I guess the party's over. I guess the party's over, man. And then Jesus is like, no, you do it. And you can just see them. You can see their brains break. Even in the New Testament, which often provides such sparse detail because it's ancient writing and pens are expensive. And so you don't get a lot of flowery language or detailed description. That's just not in language yet. And so even in the sparse language of the New Testament, you see their brains just utterly break and go, huh?
What do you mean, Jesus?
What do you mean, Jesus? There's let's call it 10 to 15,000 people here, right? You got to figure most of those dudes had wives, and most of those people would have children. And so you're looking at 10, 15,000 people, easy. And there are 5 loaves and 2 fishes.
But I love that John includes the young lad part, because who else other than some dumb kid is going to go, well, here, I got this,
Well, and
use this. Who else would have spoken up and said, you can have these 5 loaves and 2 fish?
This is one of those, I don't often use my children as sermon illustrations because it's their own lives. But there was we're actually going to talk about this in the second segment of the show, but there was a time when you and I both were running a very broke church. And the financial, someone was teasing me that I don't have gray hairs, and that's not true. This person was just shorter than me, and I've never seen them. But they're all after church budgets, right? And so the stress of church finance, we were talking about it at home. And so my son got really into the idea of donating his piggy bank to the church, right? And because I'm trying not to turn my children into walking, breathing sermon illustrations, because I really want them to choose it when it comes time to feel like they had a choice in this faith life. I would love for them to make faith a part of their lives, but I also don't want to be. I never liked people in my life being overbearing about things. I was blessed. I had a father who would certainly want me to make decisions, but never said, hey, you've got to do what I do anyways. And so he said it once, and I that's really, really nice. And then I don't mention it again. And then he comes back a few days later and is like, no, I'm going to do this. And he does, right? He had gotten a roll of, he's 5. And so he probably didn't know, he was 5 then, he's 8 now. He probably didn't know the value of this thing. He'd gotten a roll of quarters for Christmas. And so there was probably $20 in there. And he got it right just before the pandemic and never got to take it to the arcade. And so he donates his piggy bank to the church, right? As that, like, the young lad, right?
Yeah.
And that is, sometime, and I would love if that story then that church's financial problems all went away. And that's probably not true, because not everything wraps up that neatly. But I'll tell you, that church, made it and is making it, right?
Yes.
And so we all, you have that, like, super, you can imagine, as I saw my own 5-year-old, right? Like, this super innocent of, like, is this enough? And, like, it's clearly not.
Right.
And in an adult mind, like, why even bother?
To our adult skepticism, why even bother? Like, would you even have spoken up? Like, this isn't going to make a difference, so why even give it?
Why?
But to this young lad, hey, I got this. You want it?
You can imagine. You can imagine the disciples are going around, like, surveying, like, hey, do you have any food? Do you have any food? Dude, do you have any food? Like, we're trying to figure out how much food is here. And you can imagine that, like, that young lad just felt moved by that. And was like, well, I have food. And it's an absurdly little amount of food. And you can even imagine his mother is probably like, oh, here he goes again. Jesus.
Right, right.
Why you got to be like that, kid? And then that's what ends up, Jesus is able to take that and miraculously multiply it.
Because God can use whatever we have, if we will, give it over to God and let God do what God does, which is make things radically abundant in the kingdom of God.
Well, and this is where you can read this miracle one of two ways, right? You can read this miracle as Jesus just miraculously multiplied. Like, this is just, because again, these things happen, right? I don't want to. So, okay, the Thomas Jefferson Bible, which comes up a weird amount in my life. Thomas Jefferson rewrote the New Testament to take out all the miracles. He's a deist. He's a man of the Enlightenment. He thinks of himself as an incredibly enlightened man. And so from his perspective, the only problem with the Bible is it's just so unbelievable. It's so unscientific. Loves the, like, moral lessons that Jesus has to offer. But, like, if only he didn't miraculously make bread happen. And so Thomas Jefferson writes his own version of the Bible by cutting out the miracles, okay? And essentially cut out the miracles and leave the parables. So I don't want to do that, right? Because what I'm going to propose is still miraculous. But there's two ways to read this story, right? One way to read it is just read it straight. Hey, he just made bread. Someone showed up with bread. He took that one gift and miraculously, in an unscientific miracle, just broke the rules of the universe and multiplied it. God does this sometimes. Absolutely. Not every miracle needs a scientific explanation. I don't need every miracle to have a scientific explanation. It's very clear from the gospel writers. You're not going to find that scientific explanation for the resurrection. He just dead, and then he just ate. This ain't a Romeo and Juliet situation. He just dead, and then he ate. No, that isn't scientifically possible. That's the point. Okay.
Correct.
So with all of those caveats, here's another way to read it. Yo, a lot of other people had food and they were hiding it.
Yep.
Yo, there was food there, right? Did 10,000 people really show up with that food? No. That's the thing that's unbelievable, right? That all of these people wandered out in the desert without snacks, but not everyone, a good chunk of people were not going to have enough. But Jesus knew that there was enough food there. And that one young lad, as identified in John, that one person with the 5 loaves and 2 fishes was the first person who could say, yeah, I don't have enough, but you can have what I have. And then that spirit moved among all the other people with snacks in their bag. And actually there
became enough.
It became
and there
enough.
Was actually enough for people.
And I want to be clear, both of those versions of the story are valid, and both are miracles.
Yes.
Right? One is just, I can explain it scientifically, and one is sometimes God breaks the rules of science, and that's fine.
Yes.
But it's the same message either way. And I kind of, you can probably tell which one I prefer. In this case, I actually prefer that there was enough food there.
And people chose to become generous.
And people were moved miraculously to become generous because one person moved And then Jesus took that one act of kindness and multiply it by moving the crowd. It's interesting.
Yes.
He has them take the traditional worship, like teaching position for a rabbi to students. They has them all sit down.
Sit down.
Like we think of worship in like the Christian context, which again, I say this a lot. The earliest images of Christian worship we have from the catacombs in Rome, they're raising their hand like it is.
Yes, and the rabbi is the one sitting,
Right,
and the crowd is the one standing up. Yes, but we've reversed that role.
Yeah, we've reversed that role. So he had like there's clearly a teaching element happening here, and so it is interesting that to me that is part of where you could say he's going to use this as a lesson, and they're going to get moved by this lesson. Yes. Here, I have this. I offer it to you.
Yes.
What do you have to offer? Are you moved by this?
Have you read? It's a children's book. I've read a lot of children's books lately. Apparently, having children will do that to you. But
yeah, it turns out.
But have you read the children's book Stone Soup?
Yes. Yeah.
It's that same idea, right? There's a famine in the land. A gentleman comes in, says, it's okay, I can make soup from a stone. Gets a big boiling pot of water, puts a stone in it. Says, you know what would be really good, though?
Yeah.
Is if you added some carrots. And someone said, oh, I've got a couple carrots. And, well, you know what would make it extra good is if you added some potatoes. Another person, oh, I've got a potato. By the end of the story, it's a great, big, beautiful soup. And everybody in the village has enough because of this generosity, because there was this spirit of community that happened. That is a miracle, right? Like in the feeding of the 5,000.
Well, and that's where, like, I didn't, and I don't necessarily know why I didn't, but like, this is kind of where I was leading with the essay, is like, especially for us in this world of enough. In this world, there is enough food to go around. It exists. Yes. We throw a ton of it away. I love that, those statistics are like, I pulled those statistics directly from Feeding America, right? Like there is enough, we throw away almost as much food as we eat, right? We throw away 40% of all food.
Which is just mind-boggling. I
was at a potluck at Finca Tres Robles, this urban farm that's in our mission field. I mentioned them briefly in the piece, but Finca Tres Robles, like one of their things is, they want to grow food, but they want to grow food as a way of advocating about the fact that we operate in a food desert.
Right.
That, here in, it's fascinating. So we're on the ship channel. We're essentially on Houston's ship channel. We're like one of the major arteries of goods. We're actually a major coffee port. It's fun. But like we're a major artery for goods that get into the United States. And yet directly next to where these cargo ships are unloaded, often with food that we're importing, it's a food desert. There's not a grocery store. There's not access to affordable access to healthy food.
Healthy food. That's the key.
Yeah.
Is that it's not that there's no food, it's that there's not nutritiously sufficient food for the people who are living there. Access to it, anyway.
Because there is, Tommy Garcia Pratt's just the guy who, one of the guys who runs it, makes this point of just, like, for some reason, it is cheaper. So I want to follow you on a journey of the average soda drink for a second, okay? A soda starts its life as an ear of corn in the Midwest. That ear of corn gets harvested with a giant machine. That corn, which itself is nutritious food, is then processed in a chemical plant-like manner into what we call high fructose corn syrup, which is, let us essentially, it is unfermented corn liquor. Ethanol, by the way, is just that the ethanol in gasoline is just corn liquor. Like, we call it ethanol. All right, this is 10% ethanol. Yeah, your gasoline is like 10% corn liquor. That's what ethanol is. It is alcohol, ethanol, made from corn. It's corn liquor. So that's the fermented version. Unfermented corn liquor is high fructose corn syrup. That then goes to another chemical plant, gets blended with flavor agents and artificial color, gets combined with water. That then goes to a bottling plant that gets bottled. And that might be at the local level. It might get the corn didn't grow here, but Coke has some of the best whatever in the best distribution in the world. And so it's probably bottled relatively locally. And then gets dropped off gets delivered as part of a distribution deal to your local convenience store. That is cheaper than like a zucchini grown 30 miles from there.
Yep.
Right, that's like
it's insane.
That
it's
elaborate
insane.
Process that I just described. And so this is what Finta Tres Robles is trying to do, but a lot of that just gets me thinking about how many people go hungry every day in a world that is fundamentally able, we look at starvation and go, oh my God, how can God allow this? Truth is God made this world able to support us.
Yes.
And we don't actually have a problem growing food to support the human population. There's 7 billion people in this world. And this world is capable, even in this, as I'm slowly sweating, it's like 85 degrees in my studio. So in this, even in this, climate change impacted world, we're able to grow enough food.
Yes.
The issue is distribution. The issue is not
100%.
supply.
100%. And it's not easy, even if you have local farmers markets, even if you have, people that you can support, it is difficult with inflation to be able to afford to continue to grow the food that you wish to sell at the farmers market.
Or then it becomes
in your local farmers market,
It becomes difficult even to give away your extra food, right? So
yes.
There is this very purposeful law here in the city of Houston that limits how many people you can feed in a public handout food thing. So I think it was Make Food Not Bombs. Some local organization had been feeding folks outside the main public library here in Houston for decades. Just because I was at the public library this weekend. And because it's free and air conditioned. What a thing. And there's a lot of unsheltered people hang out there because it's free and air conditioned. What a thing. And so this organization, which I believe is Make Food Not Bombs, had been just doing feeding there for decades and never gotten in trouble for it. And then all of a sudden the city clamped down, started applying this law. Now they actually beat the ticket out. They didn't actually they were arrested or ticketed and anyways, they got off. But it just highlights that there's food for people. But if you just give food away to the unsheltered, well, now you're creating a public nuisance, and oh my God, more unsheltered people would come here, and heaven forbid they eat. Right? In a world that makes enough food. And this isn't even, having lived very briefly in sub-Saharan Africa, yeah, okay, I understand it's really hard to get U.S. leftover grain to Kenya. I can, right, but
there's a distribution problem.
There's a distribution problem that is beyond my understanding. But why in Texas are 1 in 8 people food insecure?
Right. That should not happen.
Should
not, and yet it does.
And yet it does, right? And so that's where my other version of the Feeding the 5,000 becomes not just oh my God, Jesus miraculously provided. Again, he definitely did. To get into the mechanics of how Jesus can miraculously provide and challenge us to be a part of that miracle.
To overcome our own, insecure, selfish natures, to be radically generous, to ensure that there is enough for all instead of just enough for me. I mean, this is the difference between what we call Sharmageddon, right? The toilet paper run of the pandemic.
That was almost my sermon intro.
Comical.
Well, and 100% preventable. So That was the alternate. I didn't open the sermon this way, but that was almost the opener of the sermon, and maybe it should have been. So we're gonna have to talk about poop. Content warning. Gonna talk very briefly about poop for a second. But as the good book says, everybody poops. So humans poop at a really predictable rate. And Georgia Pacific and all these companies that make toilet paper know exactly at what rate humans poop. And like there are seasonal variations based on whatever, like
Stomach
normal
flus and whatever.
bugs,
Right,
stomach
normal
flus,
things.
etc. Right. And you can't ship toilet paper really far because it's so light and so bulky that the transportation costs are dumb, right? Like, and so it's all within a few 100 miles of your house. Your toilet paper is made relatively local to you. And it's really predictable. And COVID doesn't really alter the way you poop.
At all.
Or like some people, COVID does a lot of random things.
Ebola.
It's not
Ebola.
it's not Ebola. It's not E. coli. Like it just
Coli,
very few people. And I've had COVID 3 times. It's true. I have a different long COVID symptom from each time. But like it affects a lot of you, but very seldom is it digestive. So like COVID didn't make us all start pooping more. It just
made us panic.
It just made us panic.
It made us panic that there was not going to be enough resource.
For a thing that we don't actually need, right? I understood why there was a shortage of disinfectant, especially early in the pandemic when we really thought that was going to be helpful. That supply chain is different, and like that is at least gets closer to a survival instinct.
Right.
This is purely a comfort instinct.
Yep.
And we just failed. We just failed as a society.
As a society, we did not do well during the pandemic.
Well, and
taking care of each other.
And like toilet paper, like we can talk about like all the vaccine stuff that happens later, and that gets really different, and it is like whatever. Like I don't even want to deal with that. The public health part of my brain needs to just not. I don't even mean that.
But toilet paper.
It was toilet paper.
But
right?
it was toilet paper. Why was it toilet paper? Why was that the thing?
Right.
And why was there not enough to go around?
I understand why there weren't enough.
The same question.
I understand why there weren't enough webcams. Who knew that everyone was going to need a webcam all at the same time?
Right.
Right? I understand why there weren't enough graphics cards. Same. Right? Like, trust me, I'm trying to build all these streaming systems for churches, and I can't find my supplies because everyone needs them. Cool. I get it. Your need for toilet paper didn't change.
Correct.
All it was being worried that we weren't going to have enough and making sure that we get ours without any thought of what anyone else is going to need. Mm-hmm. And that's where we have to step back and go, is that a Christian instinct?
So the real miracle is in this feeding of the 5,000.
Or at least part of it.
That there was generosity.
There was generosity. Right.
That there was radical generosity from the young lad, and then
maybe from
else.
this kind of version that I frame it of like, and maybe then the crowd was moved, and that's the miracle. Right. Or then Jesus responds. Either way, Jesus responds, right? Like, however we want to frame this miracle, that's part of the miracle. And part of the challenge from this miracle, to me, is for us to recognize the role that we can have in somebody else having enough, right? Yes. I get that, like, we've got to eat, the classic from getting on an airplane, right? Put on your own oxygen mask first and then help another, right? Like, I'm not going on a hunger strike here. We got to eat, right? I get that. But also, we live in a world where there's enough food. We lived in a country even in, April of 2020 when, everyone's buying bidets. This is what we did was give the biggest windfall ever to manufacturers of bidets in the United States. Didn't know there would be that much poop stuff on this episode, did you, when you turned in? Ha! Gotcha. But like, there was enough toilet paper. There was enough.
Right.
And
there is enough food.
There is enough food.
There is enough. It's being content with enough. Right. Not excess, but enough.
And understanding that regardless of whatever economic system you live in, as a Christian person, we are all responsible for the world, right? Because we are many Christs. We are the body of Christ. We are part of God's provision mechanism for the world. We have this responsibility to, when we have enough, then share so that we may be somebody else's miracle of defeating the 5,000. Mm-hmm. Right? The oh my God, I remember I was an associate pastor and making minimum salary, which essentially meant it was a family of 3 living on minimum salary, which we could qualify for food stamps. There's some real rich pastors and there's a lot of real broke pastors. And it was December and things were tough. And miraculously, like, some members of my congregation showed up at our house with a whole catering, whatever those are called, like catering tray worth of tamales. Like, it wasn't like nice. A small plastic bag full of tamales. It was an absurd amount of tamales for 3 people.
That's an incredible Christmas gift.
It was an incredible
Anybody
Christmas
can
gift.
Show up to my house with that any day of
right. And it was one of those, like, they had made enough for their family and a bunch extra, and they're like, hey, we're going to go share it with our pastor. And like, that made a huge difference for us that Christmas. And it was because some Christian people were like, well, we could eat even more tamales. I bet they ate plenty of tamales that year, but like, we could eat even more tamales. Or like, hey, we can, let's go help, Pastor Trey and his family. And like, we were on the receiving end of it, and it was absolutely miraculous. And it really mattered. And it came from that, not just Jesus zapping food into existence. It came from a multiplication of the generosity of God.
Yes.
And that is as good a place as any. I'm going to go become mildly less sweaty. And then we will continue on with our next segment on how to restart a church. We'll be right back. And we're back for a segment that we call How to Restart a Church. And generally, this is our kind of place to talk about the work that we are doing as we, as servants of Christ, attempt to do literally that, to restart a church and to share what we're learning and the theologies and the methodologies and whatever, right? Like, there's a lot of churches out there that find themselves on the back foot for whatever reason. They don't get the luxury of just cleanly starting anew, and they've got to restart. And I say that, like, we servants of Christ, because I was cruising my news feed. I have a very weird news feed. The Religion News Service, RNS, is a part of my news feed because I need to know what's happening in church world. And I come across this article entitled "Left Behind by Disaffiliation: Texas Towns United Methodist Charter a New Church." All 7 United Methodist churches in this city in the Texas Panhandle voted to leave the country's second largest denomination. An 83-year-old UMC minister became determined that UMC wouldn't become extinct in Amarillo. And then there's this picture that includes a person I know. It includes the person on the other side of this podcast.
That's me, 5th from the left there.
Yeah, and so I am blessed that Pastor Emily is working with us here, working largely remotely with us here at Servants of Christ, but you have a secret double life where you are working alongside this new church start. So you're restarting churches is like all you do, right?
I know it's a weird season of my life where I'm in multiple places with different kinds of new church starting, ministries.
And so I'll give a little bit of history. We touched on this before. I kind of pray that non-United Methodists are listening to the show. This is not meant to be like Lord knows no one needs a United Methodist Church insider baseball podcast, right? Like no one needs that. So for those of you who are not United Methodist, welcome. We're so glad you're here. We, as a denomination, are still in the midst of like a malarkey. We're like a very small but meaningful chunk of churches are leaving to go do a different thing, and we bless them on their way. And then, about 80% of us remain, but now differently allocated. And up in Northwest Texas, where you are, a much higher percentage of folks left than, say, here in Houston, where a much lower percentage of folks left.
Right. In this particular part of Texas where we moved, when we moved up here as a United Methodist pastor, I'm looking for where is the local church that I'm going to start attending. Usually there's more than one United Methodist church to choose from. And I started looking around and calling and, hey, are you sticking around? Are you remaining United Methodist? And the answer was no. Yeah. To all of them. There were none. But there was this extremely faithful remnant of people who were dedicated to remaining United Methodists, to having this big tent theology. And they were being led by this beautiful retired minister, Margie McNear, who is fabulous. And she and several other retired clergy and people came on board to start meeting they started in a nursing home, and then they moved. They're now being housed in a Presbyterian sanctuary. But it's been beautiful watching them grow from just this small remnant to now there's 150 people at their charter service.
That's amazing.
There were 101 people in worship this last week, all in just the matter of a few months. So it's been great to see all of these folks come together for this united vision. And everyone in the room is United Methodist on purpose. They have chosen that. And so that's been a really wonderful thing, is it's a very unified congregation. So they're able to accomplish quite a bit.
Well, but then, you and I, because I get pulled into this conversation because I design, streaming video systems for small and medium-sized churches. And so I end up in this conversation too. Very, very small part. But talking about that in Northwest Texas, geography just be different, right? You and I, you're from Abilene. You took us on a mission trip to Abilene. And what I walked away from that is like, I am used to, I've lived in East Texas. I've lived in Central Texas. I went to college 1,200 miles from home. I am used to a certain kind of long distance driving, maybe more so than most humans. In Northwest Texas, that's just different. And so talk a little bit about like what role this kind of church in Amarillo is having to serve because of the nature of the geography of where y'all are.
So, yes, when you measure distance in hours and not miles, it's a little bit different up here. But the model that they're working off of is not one that's new. It's actually very old. It's a circuit rider model, right? It's what it's what Methodists started doing.
It's also what Paul, like it goes back to Paul. It's what Paul did, right?
Right. It's these missionary journeys. And so the main idea behind what will happen up here is there will be hub churches with spokes that will help send pastors and resources and people as needed to these smaller places out in rural North Panhandle, Texas. Some as far as 90 and 100 miles away.
Wow,
that's a good 3-hour round trip on a Sunday if you live in Amarillo. But modern technology being what it is, this is why it's important to have live streaming services. It's why Trey has been brought on board to help facilitate really good high quality production. because that matters a lot more when the person that you see, you don't actually see in person.
Yeah.
You see them on a screen. And so, how we can stay connected, how we can help these smaller congregations, these other remnants in these smaller towns to stay together, to be resourced, to do the work of the kingdom in their small corner of the world.
Well, but I think it applies. Like, this is something born out of this initiative, right? Is born out of a weird moment in Methodist history that we find ourselves in, and the fascinating geography of Northwest Texas. Just truly like it is. If you listening to this show and live on the East Coast, it would be like, what if you live in New York City and your pastor is in Philadelphia, right? Like, or if you live in Europe, this is like, what if your pastor is in Amsterdam and you live in Luxembourg City? Like, that's 2 countries away, right? Like, the geography of Northwest Texas is just, it is unlike almost anywhere else. But like, I think this speaks to this broader question of what is church, right? Mm-hmm. There's this interesting series on Disney Plus called Forky Asks a Question. Forky, the character from Toy Story 4, like asks like basic questions, but like
what is a friend? What is money? What is
like, but and it's often like, what is friend? And so I often, when I say that, like I think about like that always is in the Forky voice of, what is church?
What is church?
What is church? Right? This is an interesting question, as we can no longer, I guess this goes back to what we're always saying, but like, we can no longer assume even that church is the people you meet with in a box, even if that box is a restaurant, right? Like what we've talked about, what we're trying to do. Even if that box is a coffee shop, that's still like, it's just I think of it as a better box. It's a box I want to be in more. But church may not even be this like meeting in a better box.
Right.
Church may be, there's an initiative that a lot of us know about called Simple Church, but like, it may even be this like, yeah, there's a hub. There's someone who's driving like a lesson curriculum, and they may be in a box or they may not. A Checkpoint Church that I talked to in developing some of the digital stuff. Like his is a purely digital church. And like, you know, it has things
different
that look
kind of box like this. Like,
yeah, it's a rectangle. It's a 16 by 9 box.
There you go.
And you know, and we are here together in a 16 by 9 box. We've had 4 hours of meetings this week together in this 16 by 9 box.
Yes, we have.
But it is like this, just totally like reconstructing what it means to be church, boiling it down to, it's a religious community that is connected in some way, that's sharing in a curriculum set by we use the word pastor. I know other people have other words, but like set by like a religiously trained person. But like, it is like, what's so cool about what y'all are doing, it is this gloriously amorphous thing that's much more equipped to just respond to the modern world, rather than saying, yes, no, you meet in this box.
And you have to have a worship, and you have to have a Sunday school hour, and you have to have this program and that program. All of that model is out the window. There is a group of people meeting up here in a grooming salon.
Nice.
Because 2 of the members own it, and they want to be able to bring their dogs to worship. And so it is. Everybody can come. Everybody and their dog.
Everyone and their dog. Right.
Can come to these worship times that they have together. And so it's not about recreating church just in a different space, church as you have known it. It's about being nimble. It's about responding to where the Holy Spirit is, and, you know, catching that fire and seeing where that goes. So it's an interesting time to be in this part of the world.
Yeah.
It's also strange because, you know, I'm part of this congregation that is searching for a place to worship, and then I'm part of this Servants of Christ, who is, getting different places of worship. There's all sorts of real estate changes happening all over. But realizing that God is not limited by real estate, right? That God is already there in the grooming salon, in the God-shaped box, in, whatever it is that you are, where two or three are gathered, right? That is where God is. And so being able to move in that and be innovative in that.
And you don't, and I saw this, we've seen this with like the success of church in Africa and South America. A lot of it has been, hey, we're just going to worship sitting underneath this tree today. Because there's not the resources even to throw up a building yet.
Right.
Or we constructed this weird shack thing. This is church now, right? It is so much beyond just what we've thought of it forever, right? Here's the church, here's the steeple, open the door and see other people. But also reliant on, you definitely need 40 people to gather together, and
to hear 3 worship songs, and then to pass a plate, and then to hear one person stand up and talk, and then,
But even, and this is where it starts to, we learned from other digital communities, right? You are not, because we can no longer assume that, everyone goes to church, right? No. So you may be, when it is now really common to be a Star Wars fan, but when I was in 5th grade, Star Wars had hit hard for me and my friends at my old school, but then I moved countries and moved back to the United States to a new school, and very few people were into Star Trek or Star Trek or Star Wars, either of them, honestly. But Star Wars was more front of mind at that time. But I found that 2 other people at my little school, and we would talk about Star Wars all the time. Right? Yes. And so we would have our little community.
It's comic books. Right? It's comic book nerds. Nobody knew who Marvel, any of these superheroes were, and now it's a huge franchise.
But this is where comic conventions, Star Trek conventions kept the flame of Star Trek alive far better than Paramount ever did. Right? And now it's
any
booming.
Of the cons. Any of the cons, right?
And so hey, wait, we know this model, but we forgot it.
Yes.
Right? We know that this is literally that's the history of the United Methodist Church. We just described it. Hey, there's 10 people here, and 10 people here, and 10 people here, and then every year we gather at this convention. We called it a conference, but it's convention.
It's a con. Yeah.
We've been here before.
Yes, we have.
And so, and the modern world is pushing us in that direction again. Where there may not be enough of your particular vein of Christianity to have, 40 people in a whitewashed box with a steeple. And so church may be about the small community in your immediate area, connected digitally, and then periodically in person to a broader amount of people in a wider geographic area. And that is actually just how many other people experience community in the 21st century.
All the time.
Yes. Right? That this will not surprise anybody. I am a vintage video game collector, right? No one else in my life really is. In my life directly, right? My best friend grew up and he kind of left the game. He got interested in other things. It's fine. Jimmy didn't betray me, but there used to be someone I could talk to about this. So I love going to the flea market. And that's my community space where I hang out online with people who know all about this stuff. And, we share interesting stories about the N64 DD, this super obscure, only in Japan version of the N64. But like in this weird little community, we all know about it. And that Animal Crossing was originally a Nintendo 64 DD game. And isn't that really interesting? It isn't, but we sure think it is. And then when I want that experience but like in my neighborhood, there's not enough of us to like have a meeting, but like those of us who are interested in this, like we go to flea markets, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where a lot of the hobby and the like in person, and we go to conventions every once in a while. There's a great one in Austin. And like that is the community side. And what I love about what the Amarillo Church is doing is like taking this very modern way of being community, which is very distributed. Yes. And saying, oh, right, this too can be church.
Yes.
Right? Like this too can, like, you don't need 40 people in Ranger, Texas. I'm pulling random now. You don't, like, there may not, at this point in history, because of splits and whatever, or just because of the
whatever reason,
a secularizing world, a failure of church outreach, all the other things we talk about, there may not, I'll pick on East Texas for a second. There may not be 40 people left in Diboll, who want to be, I can do a lot. There's a lot of towns in Texas I can do with it. I've lived in a lot of it. There may not be that critical mass. Like you need a critical mass to be able to have a whitewashed church building with a steeple and
to be able to financially support a pastor full time,
right.
To be able to, whatever you need to do, right? Fill in the blank.
And yet what y'all have said is, okay, cool. So we're going to build some really good digital ministry, and we're going to really think about what it means to make the in-person count in meaningful ways. And like there are some local connections and there's some broader connections. It can all be this thing we call church, but it starts from like, y'all are put in here by circumstance, but the response y'all have come up with is like this really cool modern thing.
Yes. And it speaks to that spirit of generosity that we were talking about earlier, because you're not worried about, well, we have to hang on to our resources because we have to make sure that we survive and we make it and that there's enough for us. It's no. We have something, we can share it. We have, pastors, we have resources, we have curriculum, we have support. Let us help you. Let us share with you that which we have been blessed with so that everybody can then thrive, so that the mission of God can continue.
But Emily, how do you enter that into a spreadsheet?
You can't count that number. It
right.
doesn't
You can't
work.
count that number.
The statistics don't work for this. It doesn't make sense. But it does make sense for the kingdom of God.
Right. Because there's a friend of ours who I won't name on this podcast who, in a lot of denominations, not just ours, there's periodically you have to send things in to update the spreadsheets. And I might sometimes have sarcastically said the purpose of worship in the United Methodist Church is to update the spreadsheets. Right. And he didn't send in his reports. And that is like a tremendously rebellious act in a tightly integrated denomination. But also it speaks to that, like, the kingdom of God cannot be reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. And if we stop thinking about the things you would normally track on a spreadsheet, giving, in-person worship attendance,
people in the pews, people in the Sunday
pews,
school,
butts in the seats,
right.
And start thinking about who are we connecting with, and how are people spiritually growing, and who has encountered Christ in the midst of this, and letting go of a lot of those assumptions, you can get somewhere. Anyway, we can go on and on about this. It's the purpose of one of the purposes of the show. But anyway, I know a famous person. I can't, it's not often,
It's a little weird seeing that picture on MSN's news feed. I was like, oh, we're the homepage. That's awesome.
It was really, it was often doom scrolling is a terrible thing. And here I'm scrolling through Twitter and RMS's X, whatever. We're just going to call it Twitter. I try to call people by the names they want to be called. I'm not sure I'm going to call Elon Musk's vanity project what he wants it to be called. But like, scrolling Twitter, and there is, I was like, oh, I know those people. If
Yep.
you would like to be a part of this conversation, we have an email address that works. At least there's one that works for now, and the old one may come back. We may have fixed our ability to create email addresses. But in the meantime, I have created thegoodnessofgodpod at gmail.com. Thegoodnessofgodpod, P-O-D, at gmail.com. If you have thoughts that you would like to share with this show, email us there, and we will gladly do a user feedback segment of this show. One of the joys of podcasting is it can become this really participatory exercise. And so please send us your comments. If you'd like to know more about what we do here at Servants of Christ, you can just go to servantsnow.org. You can also find an audio version of this show wherever finer podcasts are purveyed, or a video version of the show on Facebook at facebook.com/servantsnow, on YouTube at youtube.com/servantsnow, or at servantsnow.org/media-lab. This show is a product of the Servants Now Media Lab at Servants of Christ United Methodist Parish, deep in the heart of Southeast Houston. It is made possible by an Innovators Grant by the Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. If you would like to support us, you can also go to servantsnow.org and help us do ministry. But right now, please go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and we'll see you next week.